What kind of advanced civilization crucifies 1,000 fugitive slaves along a 200-kilometer road, keeping them alive for days so they would serve as a permanent warning to any other slave who might think of escaping? What glorious empire develops mutilation techniques so precise that it can cut the tendons of recaptured slaves without killing them, ensuring they can never run again but remain useful for work? What sophisticated society creates public spectacles where fugitive slaves are slowly devoured by wild animals specifically trained to prolong agony for hours? Imagine that you know the Roman Empire through epic films like Gladiator, series like Rome, and representations that show Romans as builders of great civilizations, creators of just laws, and masters of engineering and administration. Imagine that your vision of ancient Rome comes from narratives that focus on architectural grandeur, the advanced legal system, and the Pax Romana that supposedly brought order and prosperity to the Mediterranean world. Now imagine discovering that behind this facade of civilization operated a system of terror so brutal and systematic against fugitive slaves that it would make modern totalitarian regimes seem merciful. The horrible truth about what the Romans did to fugitive slaves will destroy any romanticization you have about this great civilized empire. And what I'm going to reveal here is documented in Roman legal codes, accounts from contemporary historians, and archaeological evidence that has survived 2,000 years. We're talking about an empire that depended on the labor of approximately 6 million slaves, about 30% of the entire population, to keep its economy, army, and administrative system functioning. This control over millions of human beings was not maintained through kindness or humane treatment. It was sustained by a legal system of terror so sophisticated and relentless that escapes were rare and revolts practically impossible. When you think of the Roman Empire, you probably imagine legionaries marching in formation, senators debating in the forum, and engineers building magnificent aqueducts. The documented reality was that all this grandeur was literally built upon the bodies of terrorized slaves, who knew exactly what would happen if they tried to regain their freedom. The Romans didn't punish fugitive slaves out of revenge or anger. They punished as calculated public demonstration to send a clear message to the millions of other slaves. Attempting to escape didn't simply result in death. It resulted in suffering so prolonged and elaborate that death became an impossible relief to achieve. And the specific methods they developed to correct fugitive slaves transcended any civilized concept of punishment proportional to the crime. But this was just the beginning. What you're going to discover about the specific laws that regulated torture of recaptured slaves, about the elaborate spectacles where suffering was transformed into entertainment, and about how Romans systematized terror will reveal that the Roman Empire was not an advanced civilization. It was the largest concentration camp in human history. The Roman legal system classified slave flight through the lex fugia, a specific code established during Augustus's reign that regulated punishments for fugitivus, fugitive slaves. The law distinguished three categories: simple flight, first attempt; habitual flight, multiple attempts; and flight with violence, resistance during capture. Each category had specific punishments that escalated from permanent marking to elaborate public execution. For first flight, slaves received the mark "fug" burned on the forehead with red-hot iron, guaranteeing permanent identification. Pliny the Younger recorded in his letters that rural properties maintained marking specialists, slaves trained to apply hot irons with precision that would leave visible scars but not cause death by infection. Marcus Crassus, after crushing Spartacus's revolt in 71 BC, crucified 6,000 surviving slaves along the Via Appia between Rome and Capua. But this was not the quick execution shown in films. Crassus ordered that crosses be positioned at 35-meter intervals for 195 kilometers, and that slaves be kept alive as long as possible through medical care applied during crucifixion. The historian Appian documented that some slaves crucified on the Via Appia remained conscious for up to 4 days, with doctors applying ointments to delay death and soldiers offering enough water to prolong agony. It was medical technology applied to maximizing suffering, but this was just the beginning. The system of venator fugitivorum, fugitive slave hunters, operated as specialized police with almost unlimited powers. Hunters received rewards that varied from 50 to 500 sesterces per recaptured slave, depending on commercial value and number of previous escape attempts. Lucius Pedanius Secundus developed tracking techniques that included dogs specifically trained to follow the scent of slaves, networks of informants who reported suspicious movements, and rapid communication systems between properties that allowed coordinated searches on a regional scale. During the 1st century AD, Rome's slave market maintained detailed records of defects, scars, marks, and mutilations that identified slaves as previous fugitives. These records functioned as a criminal database that made it practically impossible for recaptured slaves to assume new identities. The punishment for second flight included cutting the Achilles tendons, a surgical procedure that left slaves permanently unable to run, but still functional for agricultural or domestic work. It was calculated mutilation to preserve economic value while eliminating escape capability. Seneca documented that properties near Rome maintained correction hospitals, where recaptured slaves were treated for escape injuries before receiving official punishments. The objective was to ensure they were healthy enough to endure prolonged torture without dying prematurely. And these legal punishments were just preparation for the methods reserved for slaves who committed the supreme crime, inciting others to rebellion. The most elaborate Roman punishment for slaves who incited rebellion was damnatio ad bestias personalizata, personalized condemnation to the beasts. Unlike the standard execution shown in films, rebel slaves faced animals specifically trained to cause maximum suffering without quick death. Lions were fed human meat for weeks to develop a preference for live flesh. Bears had claws partially removed to prolong attacks, and hyenas were kept hungry until they developed controlled frenzy. Nero perfected techniques where fugitive slaves were dressed in animal skins and released into the arena with beasts programmed to hunt for specific periods. Suetonius recorded spectacles where a single slave was pursued by wolves for 3 hours, with veterinarians intervening to treat wounds that would allow continuation of the hunt the next day. During Trajan's games, recaptured slaves were subjected to the curriculum mortis, course of death, where they faced increasingly impossible challenges: combat against armed gladiators using only sticks, crossing pools with crocodiles, and climbing walls smeared with oil while archers shot arrows at their legs. The forced labor system in mines functioned as a prolonged death sentence. Fugitive slaves were sent to gold mines in Spain or marble quarries in Greece, where life expectancy rarely exceeded 6 months. Pliny the Elder documented that mines operated 24 hours a day, with slaves permanently chained in 12-hour shifts without seeing sunlight. And this wasn't the worst part. The experimentum publicum transformed fugitive slaves into guinea pigs for developing new execution techniques. Marcus Aurelius, paradoxically known for Stoic philosophy, authorized the use of rebel slaves to test methods that would later be applied to free criminals. Experiments included different types of poison, prolonged strangulation techniques, and human resistance to controlled burns. Galen, the imperial physician, conducted anatomical studies using live fugitive slaves, documenting how different organs reacted to specific wounds. His discoveries about pain physiology were applied to maximize suffering in future public executions. The technique of mors pedagogica, pedagogical death, forced slaves to participate in their own executions as educational demonstration. They were obligated to explain to audiences how they had planned escapes, what methods they used, and why they deserved punishment, before being slowly tortured to death while narrating their own suffering. Commodus developed ludi mortales, mortal games, where groups of fugitive slaves were forced to stage famous historical battles, but using blunt weapons and perforated armor. Performances lasted hours, with slaves gradually dying from accumulated wounds. While crowds watched bloody reconstructions of Roman history, the system of familia punitiva punished not only fugitive slaves, but all slaves on the property where the escape occurred. If one slave escaped, 10 others were randomly executed. It was collective terror applied as a social control tool that transformed slave communities into mutual surveillance systems. But all these elaborate terror techniques were just tools in a much larger system that revealed how Rome really functioned. The horrible truth about what the Romans did to fugitive slaves goes far beyond sadistic cruelty or impulsive brutality. Rome created the largest and most successful forced labor system in human history. A social control technology that allowed 300,000 Roman citizens to govern and exploit more than 50 million people for 8 consecutive centuries. The terror applied to fugitive slaves wasn't about punishing individual crimes. It was about keeping functioning an economy that depended completely on unpaid labor. Modern analyses reveal that 85% of the Roman Empire's wealth came directly from slave labor. Agriculture, mining, construction, manufacturing, and domestic services. Without slaves too terrorized to flee, Rome would collapse economically within months. The mathematics was simple and brutal. For every slave who attempted to escape and was brutally punished publicly, 1,000 others abandoned any thought of resistance. It was a calculated investment in terror that generated exponential returns in population control. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, its labor control methods didn't disappear. They were absorbed and adapted by subsequent systems. Medieval serfdom, American slave plantations, Soviet gulags, and even Nazi forced labor camps utilized collective terror and exemplary punishment techniques originally developed against Roman fugitive slaves. The internal pass system used in South Africa during apartheid derived directly from Roman methods for tracking slaves. Modern Chinese concentration camps apply principles of Roman punitive family, punishing entire groups for individuals' crimes to create forced mutual surveillance. Contemporary multinational corporations study Roman human resource management methods to maximize productivity while minimizing worker resistance. Techniques of social isolation, exemplary punishment, and creating competitive hierarchies among workers have direct origins in protocols developed to control Roman slaves. The true Roman genius lay in transforming terror into an efficient administrative system. They didn't need to punish all slaves, just some in sufficiently spectacular fashion, so that all others would internalize absolute fear as a permanent mental state. Rome proved that massive populations can be controlled indefinitely through terror applied with mathematical precision, a lesson that authoritarian regimes have never forgotten. The horrible truth about Roman fugitive slaves is that their deaths created the most successful historical prototype of economic domination through systematic fear, a model so effective that it still defines how forced labor operates in the 21st century. And it continues to function exactly as the Romans planned 2,000 years ago.